Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
Maybe they didn't want to publish it or whatever, so it didn't get published. And but they posted it for whatever reason. Maybe JFK Records Act made them declassify, but it was actually posted on the CIA website, and I downloaded a copy. They subsequently took it down, but I got this and I showed it to Peter. I'm like, Peter, this essay is here online, and you wrote this. And he was like, I did write that. And what happened to this essay? And so we reworked that, and he studied this same subject for decades, so he actually knows a lot more about it. And it was a 2010 book that really expanded on these particular aspects. The World Commerce Corporation setting up the heroin connection even before the CIA did, with the help of Rockefeller and William Donovan of the OSS and so on. So it's like he was working on these things for decades, and it's just an amazing kind of arc of his life to be working in these territories for so long, and not that many people did. He was a tenured English professor, and so he used his tenure, which most academics sadly really don't in a good way, to write about these issues, even as he was also working in poetry and other things. And he's just an amazing character. He's recovering from COVID, and we're hoping he's going to make a full recovery soon, because we're getting ready to do some Watergate stuff with him and Jim Hogan very, very soon. We had to postpone it, but he's just been a huge inspiration and a great friend and mentor.
Well, I mean, one thing that's unmistakable, reading your work or Peter Dale Scott, is that the conception of the Central Intelligence Agency and really the entire intelligence state as basically a form of organized crime. I mean, I've said before, like, if you want to understand the CIA, it's kind of like they're the WASP mafia. And like that extends, not just assassinations and narco trafficking and control of black markets, or the many criminal allies that they use as their cat's paw to carry out these kind of, covert operations around the world. But I'm saying, like, functionally, as a matter of charter, they exist to break the law and break the law every day on a scale that is astonishing. I have a quote here from your book. In 1996, a House Intelligence Committee report stated that CIA officials had revealed that the agency's operation arm is the only part of the intelligence community, indeed of the government, where hundreds of employees on a daily basis are directed to break extremely serious laws in countries around the world. A conservative estimate is that several hundred times every day, Directorate of Operations officers engage in highly illegal activities. So, like, I mean,
Right.
like, yeah. So you just talk a bit about like this, just sort of like the function of the CIA as basically a criminal organization on behalf of Wall Street empire. How is this structured? Can it be understood as a kind of a mafia family?
I mean, I think the organized crime thing is a pretty easy analogy. It's not perfect in a way, but organized crime itself really deserves some more interrogation. Organized crime could another way to describe it most of the time is tolerated crime. I mean, before, if you've ever seen Boardwalk Empire, I think that
Of course, yeah.
show is really the deep political system. I think that he may have read his Peter Dale Scott, actually, because the guy is like, he's intertwined between the economic elite, the political system, and the underworld of organized crime. And that's sort of how it existed in many ways before the creation of the CIA. And the CIA precursor, the OSS, they sprang Meyer Lansky, or no, at Meyer Lansky's request, they sprang Lucky Luciano from jail for
Yeah,
Operation
so that he could come
Underworld.
back and run the New York ports. I mean, like under the auspices of this idea that, like, oh, we don't want German U-boats docking in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Navy Yard or whatever. But it was like, correct me if I'm wrong, it was really about keeping labor unrest under wraps while the war was going on, and like basically exclusively meant communist aligned unions in the stevedores and longshoremen.
Yeah, the longshoremen are kind of some of the more badass union people. They're like kind of the more typically just straight up communist, and they're because of their position in the commercial systems, they have some power, and so they can afford to, like, make some demands and extract some concessions from capital. So that was the way they were brought in during World War II. But and this is, Peter has written about this in American War Machine, and this is, I think, really notable. Before the CIA is even really authorizing anything or doing business in covert operations, you have ex-OSS guys, so intelligence guys, like William Donovan, like I just mentioned, and Walter Stevenson, aka Intrepid, right? And we're in this World Commerce Corporation with financing from Rockefeller and John McCloy and other people, setting up the heroin traffic with the KMT in the Golden Triangle area before the CIA really authorizes this, and is probably dating back even before the CIA is created. But when you see this, you see that it's done by the overworld of corporate wealth, and so they're brought in a way to. I mean, they're working hand in glove with the organized crime rings that are responsible for bringing all the drugs into the United States. And while they're doing this, the U.S. authorities are blaming communist China later. They're saying like, "Oh, Mao is flooding us with heroin." It was Chinese people, but it was Taiwan. It was the KMT, the Kuomintang. It was our guys with help from the CIA. And so this relationship between organized crime and the CIA takes it to another level. They use these guys to try to kill Castro. Probably some of these people and arrangements were involved in the Kennedy assassination. I mean, Jack Ruby is the obvious case, like, concerned sex club owner who shoots Oswald. I mean, it's so over the top, and in many ways that it's this is they not only function as organized crime because they are organized and they commit crimes. They work with organized crime a lot, and in their earlier forms, similarly before there was a CIA, these entities worked with organized crime. But the thing about the way they were created was it's very vague. They're empowered by the National Security Act, but they weren't empowered really to. It's what was actually done with the authorization that they were given does not conform to what is in the document. It says that the CIA will also, from time to time, carry out some other duties as assigned by the National Security Council pertaining to national security.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like a chorus that's repeated in this song over and over again is like the U.S. empire getting involved in wars, either directly or by proxy, in parts of the world that they consider strategically important. And like, beginning with, like you said, the Golden Triangle heroin trade in Vietnam. Well, what was one of the big blowbacks from Vietnam was a huge explosion of heroin addiction, both in returning troops and in American cities. Well, like, where was that heroin coming from? You jump ahead to the 80s, like the dirty wars in Central America. How do you fund all of these secret operations? Well, all just so happens at the exact same time, there's a huge explosion of cocaine and crack addiction in American cities. And then, like, back to Afghanistan. Now there's an opiate crisis in America because, like, well, Afghanistan, that's like, where were all these poppies getting grown? I mean, again, who is controlling these black markets? And then, like, like I said, the chorus of the song is the same every time. It gets repeated throughout.
Yeah, Joe Rogan. It was funny. I don't watch a whole lot of Rogan unless he's got somebody on there that I'm interested in hearing. Just because I'm steeped in these areas, so it's like he's not my go-to source or whatever. But he said at one point in one of the things I saw, he said, "Yeah, I mean, this drug money that's out there. Do you think that like these bankers are just going to leave that on the table because it's like immoral? Of course, that goes into the system." He says something to that effect. And I think that that's exactly right. There's three commodities internationally that are the most lucrative in terms of trade. That is, the top is oil, and then weapons, and then drugs. And when you think about that, it's
Well,
like,
yeah,
well,
they're just
that's
gonna
the
like
basis.
one side of that triangle. They're just gonna be like, oh, we're not gonna touch that. Yeah, that's drugs. That's illegal. Unlike, for instance, arms sales or petroleum and where you get it out of the ground.
Yeah. I mean, but they're intertwined sometimes because, like, if you think about Afghanistan, pipeline routes were a part of that calculation.
Mm-hmm.
And then weapons, it's an expensive boondoggle to occupy that country for decades. And you have the drugs, of course, as well, a big part of that. And where does that money end up? Because the dollar is the international currency, and it has been for so long. The drug trade and organized crime itself cannot but strengthen the U.S. financial system because it moves huge funds around in the financial system and creates massive pools of capital to the point that was probably drug money that saved the economy to the extent that
It's
it
what
was
kept it from
saved.
completely collapsing in
Uh,
2008, right? It was just the huge amounts of U.S. currency that's held, in black markets overseas.
Man, it's Old Faithful. I mean, it's an Old
Yeah.
Faithful money geyser for the deep state, more or less, or deep political system,
Um,
the capitalism.
I guess okay. Like to move on slightly, I want to talk briefly about this dichotomy that you attribute to Peter Dale Scott, but the Prussian trader dichotomy when it comes to like foreign policy elites in American government and like intellectual discourse, breaking down like between sort of the neoconservative and neoliberal. both of these groups are incredibly hawkish and regard America as an empire, and that like they think that that's just and the way it should be. But how do you define the distinction between the Prussians, aka like sort of what we generally regard as hawks, and the traders, which are the neoliberals, which are, I guess, more commonly perceived of as doves. But the point is, this is just one hawk. This is just one bird of prey.
Right. I think that this is especially salient in the period from the 50s to the 70s. The conflicts between some of these camps, we call them neoliberals and neoconservatives, or Prussians traders. That's an older one. But there's much more overlap than there is difference. And in the Prussians as a group, or the neoconservatives, really arise out of the decision that I think is a result of the capitalist elites to create the military industrial complex, to deal with all the problems of integrating the post-war economy in the capitalist world. They come up with the idea of the privately incorporated war economy and the permanent war economy, and the military industrial complex as a kind of engine to keep the dollars flowing in the right way and help the East Asia, like Japan. The Korean War is a huge boost for Japan, and for South Korea and for Taiwan, and to have Western Europe not trading with Russia. And that's where we see this same business today and the way that this was laid out. But a consequence of these people like Dean Acheson, who's really a kind of a Rockefeller type of person, who's really like someone who's thinking in terms of global capitalism and how to manage it, is they create this military industrial complex that itself becomes an important factor in American power politics. Now, there was for a time an actual progressive strain in U.S. politics that I think Henry Wallace represented, the New Deal represented, and these forces get kind of taken out systematically, and to the point that like Nixon's really the last liberal trying to operate in a liberal way until Watergate removes him. And then there's some chaos. But I think that Watergate gets resolved in such a way as the neoconservatives, but also financial elites, are kind of placated in different ways, and they come to the things that they were worried about with the end of the Vietnam War. The military is kind of paranoid about Nixon going to China and the Vietnam War ending, and military budgets perhaps going down, and the sort of commercially minded people, the traders or neoliberals like Rockefeller, they're a little worried about Nixon and his protectionism, which could damage the global economy that they've set up, and his price controls and other methods, and even his friendliness to labor. Like all of these things, all the different sides of this are going at Nixon, and Nixon is removed,
And do
and
you think it's a coincidence that Nixon was the last American president in a time of inflation and rising gas prices to even consider the idea of price controls?
yeah, I mean, he put them in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and that's not even really discussed now. And this was it's I think that there are some element of the elements of this time period of the 70s that we might remember or be aware of, but that have greater significance. And I think one of them is the Gerald Ford. The was a New York Post headline that said Ford to New York City drop dead,
Drop
right?
dead.
And it was a reference to the bondholders that were like essentially assuming a new role in New York City to like dictate the fiscal solvency of the city. And this is a sort of neoliberal. This is almost like a IMF kind of situation, but for an American city. And so I think that this represented a change in the U.S. To a kind of neoliberalism. But in addition, the neoconservative forces, beginning really under Carter, although Reagan's credited for it, a huge military buildup. And this is this in this way, the consolidating the dollar regime worked out the conflicts between the neoliberals and the neoconservatives. But in doing so, you jettison whatever progressive elements there were in the American power structure. There's never another Democrat who's even as progressive as Lyndon Johnson, for example, or is Nixon. Like Nixon is,
Well,
like Chomsky says, Nixon was the last liberal.
like, and this goes back to this idea of continuity and this idea that, like, like, yes, two parties compete for the position of manager of the empire, but essentially they are competing within an artificially constrained, like, paddock of acceptable policy. And, whether it's why the fact that, like, the Pentagon budget goes up every single year. And like it is like how since the end of the Cold War, like how much has the Pentagon budget like grown exponentially since the Soviet Union collapsed? Like its only reason for existing. That money is never ever going to be spent in America on things that are like, you know, broadly popular and like would be democratically successful policies, like i.e., some sort of universal health care program, or in a some like smaller ball, just things like price controls for dealing with inflation on things like gas. These things, no matter who party, no matter what party, no matter how progressive the person is or conservative they ran as, these things are just never ever considered, nor will they be because of this this deep political system that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, Bill Clinton took office, and he's a corruptible guy. I think that they knew they probably had that he wasn't going to be out there and out of control. But he took
He had
office.
corruptible tattooed on his forehead. Like
Yeah,
it's about.
yeah. I mean, he likes women. Who knows what sort of sexual blackmail stuff they had on him, whatever. But at any rate, when he was elected, he reportedly wanted to do some more New Deal type things and kind of deal with some of the excesses of the Reagan Bush years. And early on, I guess probably shortly after he was inaugurated, Robert Rubin and Alan Greenspan take him on a little walk around the White House to give him the talk, and they explained to him like, "No, you're not going to do that, Mr. President." And so Bill Clinton, he's quoted in like this is a mainstream magazine, maybe the New York Review of Books is where this was quoted, but he says, "You mean to tell me that I owe my reelection chances to the Federal Reserve and a bunch of fucking bond traders?" Okay. And the answer was yes, that's right. You can't do that. So I think now it's so structural that it's not like you think, oh, I'm going to necessarily get assassinated. It's like that the levers of power are so firmly in the hands of these people that they're going to determine whether I succeed or fall. Reagan was their man from the beginning. But when you look at Reagan versus Carter, I mean, two things that were totally top down that helped Reagan's economy enormously: the control of oil prices, which are controlled by client states and the oil companies, and the interest rates, which is the Federal Reserve, the independent Federal Reserve, which is independent when in the U.S. politics is always code for establishment or even deep state. If you want to put a finer point on it. And so these are the ways that power operates in the U.S. And if it's not that the president or Congress couldn't do it, it's that for they things to address this, it's that they don't have they know that that is a way of pain. I think on some level. I mean, they just know not. I mean, Obama said that himself to a group of fundraisers. Supposedly, they asked him why he didn't keep more of his progressive promises. And this is a secondhand story from Ray McGovern, former CIA officer. But Obama reportedly said, "Well, look at what they did to Martin Luther King." And so, make of that what you will.
Um, I guess I want to turn to C. Wright Mills, and one of C. Wright Mills' most powerful ideas, one of his most famous, sort of like nuggets, is the idea of crackpot realism, and it's a very powerful idea, and like it sums up a lot of like the Cold War, like point being that you could rationally create a system that through the rational maintenance of it at every step you're behaving logically, but at each step you just start bringing the world closer to annihilation, that you could essentially bring about the end of the world through rational means. And I'm wondering, like, given your understanding of that, or like that heuristic through viewing policy and the behavior of the American state, is crackpot realism alive and well today? And like, where does we look in the world or like in U.S. policy today to see further evidence of this, crackpot realism?
I mean, yeah, of course it is, because look at some of these policies that we have seen in recent years. The coup in Ukraine, which people warned about, people like Mearsheimer, who said will be perceived as an enormous threat to the Russians and this is going to result in disaster. Even the current CIA officer or CIA head, right, Burns or whatever, back in the day, he said something very similar, like in maybe 2008 or nine. This came out through WikiLeaks, but there's a memo where he's saying that every person in Russia sees Ukraine as existentially important to Russia, and that the idea of them joining a Western bloc is just anathema and terrifying. So these things were out there, but the idea of expansion and containment. I think containment of never really ended as an idea. And in fact, if I can get the podcast going and successful enough, I really would like to be able to write a sequel to American Exception, where I get into what happens after the Reagan after Reagan takes over in geopolitical terms for the U.S. And the more that I think about it, I'm kind of maybe spoiling my own book here, but I think that those rollback crazies of the 50s and 60s that wanted to roll back communism, I think that they, in a way, are victorious under Reagan, and that the fall of the Soviet Union, which happened partly because of collapsing the oil prices at the perfect time, almost down to zero. I mean, like where a barrel of oil is like in single digits, right? And that this mentality of like going, sticking it to Russia, making sure that they could not only dismembering the Soviet Union, but also damaging Russia to and weakening them to the point that they could never rise again. That this was sort of maniacally pursued by the national security state, and we see it in its most above board in the expansion of NATO and putting these missiles around Russia, which they initially said were for Iran to protect against Iran, but everybody knew it was for Russia. And then also in these weird, dirty wars involving Al Qaeda all throughout the 1990s, and where the U.S. uses Al Qaeda as its kind of sock puppet in Bosnia and Kosovo, Chechnya, Azerbaijan. They try to use him to the Al Qaeda people to assassinate Gaddafi in 1997, with MI6 being involved there. And then the Afghanistan war has to be seen as also as a way of like getting into that area, getting into Eurasia, and it's a kind of like a rollback or forward projection of U.S. power into more and more of the world, and that I think is very much a type of crackpot realism, and it shows that that has been the operant worldview and mentality since for the last few decades, and it brought about, I think, the end of the Soviet Union in some ways, and also the aggressive U.S. actions after that. That they wanted to get rid of the bipolar world order to establish a unipolar world order with America as ruling the world in perpetuity. And if you want to read some vintage crackpot realism, Project for a New American Century, Rebuilding America's Defenses. It's that mentality is it's still with us. It didn't go away in C. Wright Mills after C. Wright Mills died.
All right, I guess, Aaron, this is my last question for you today. So like, taking what we discussed, or like understanding that we are citizens of a country that is at best a managed democracy, and in all likelihood a totally fake one. But at the same time, we are still citizens of this country. We are still in some sense responsible for the conduct of the world we live in, or the place we find ourselves in. So like, what would, like, as an just as an individual citizen, and I know that doesn't leave people with much, but what does effective resistance to like deep politics or the deep state look like? Is it even possible? And like, like what lessons can we draw about what is sort of a productive way to talk about, or even like resist and fight back against like these forces that we're talking about?
Well, you're talking about the most powerful empire in human history, the wealthiest and the deadliest, really, in terms of its real and potential, violent power. So this it's kind of accepting our powerlessness in some way, because we don't really live in a democracy, and somehow internalizing what that means. I think in a way it could kind of get us to recognize that the stakes for some of these political arguments are not so high because we are so disempowered. And so coming at peace with these things is important. I think not lying to yourself is important. Not lying to people around you. Tell the truth as much as possible. Take care of yourself and people around you to the extent that is possible, and wait until conditions change. Because I think that historically speaking, these world historic events are going to relegate the U.S. empire to the same state of all other empires in human history. Empires fall, and that is going to happen. And hopefully, the human civilization isn't ended in the process. Although that's a real possibility because we have a uniquely destructive set of weapons. But the just accepting these, trying to grapple with reality as best you can, as much as you can, and speaking to people around you, being out if you're in any public forum, talk about things like the criminality of the state, and try to be as optimistic and realistic as you can about all of these issues, knowing that we don't live in a country where there's the ability to for regular people to impact power, and it's harsh. It's a harsh reality, but in a way, it's a little bit. There are aspects of it that are liberating because you can't get too upset about things that you can't control, or at least you can know that you shouldn't. So if it's not, I would love to be able to say, like, if you do this, then that'll solve the
Yeah.
problems.
An enemy has been slain. Enemy killing spree.
Sometimes